Welcome, everybody, to this conversation with William Carlson talking about Nazis and masculinity. I hear you have some interesting stuff about that, so I want to hear your thoughts on how Nazis viewed masculinity, the perfect man, things like that. Take it away, because I know you have some good thoughts.
So I'll just get started with Nazis and masculinity is a bit of an interesting topic because the Nazis themselves has a very aggressive ideology, you could say, and there's a lot of very interesting articles and research that have gone into this. So to kind of boil it down into its barest necessities, the Nazis heavily encouraged a hypermasculine person, i.e., someone who's very stoic, strong, disciplined, focused on service to the state, and in other words, the ideal soldier. And that's really what the Nazis tried to envision as the perfection for a man, for what they wanted men to be like. And obviously, because they're the Nazis, they have this heavily racial element, which is the idea of Aryan supremacy. So, very much the idea of the German people, the Aryan people, that they're superior. And within the Nazi ideology, any perfect man is going to be an Aryan man. And any other type of person of any other type of race is not going to be considered the same or the same level compared to the Aryan man. So that's the core essentials of what the Nazis thought about masculinity and manliness and stuff like that, and what they wanted men to be like. But there's a lot of details that we obviously start going into about that.
So what exactly do you think that the Nazis saw as the peak man that they tried to make the standard for their society in Germany back in the 40s?
Let me just start with the ideal for Nazism, and that's pretty well clearly defined a lot through their artwork, through what the speeches and the things that they talk about. So the Nazi ideal, when you visualize it, you can really see it in their propaganda, especially their military propaganda. If you look up, if you type in Nazi military propaganda, you're going to come up with images of lots of very stoic-faced, blonde-haired soldiers, and they're often in uniform. And this is in other media as well. If you look at Nazi media, it's the Triumph of the Will and other propaganda like that. It's always about these super disciplined, highly focused warriors. They're on par with everything. The whole thing with Nazism is it's very Darwinistic in the sense that you need to be strong and tough and capable for Germany so that you can fight and die for the German state. And that's another thing about Nazi masculinity is it's always paired with service to the state, and it's always about what can you do? If you're a soldier, we want you to fight well and die well. If you can't necessarily fight in the military, you need to at least be working and stuff like that. And this also kind of extends to the Nazi military units. So there's the SS and the SA, and so the SS were the Nazi paramilitary power, taking power over the previous generation, the SA. What's actually kind of interesting about the SA is that Hitler had grown concerned about the power of the SA, and he removed it from power, replacing it with the SS. And interestingly enough, one of the leaders of the SA was a man named Ernst Röhm, who was actually gay, but he saw himself as more of a man because of that, because he's super masculine, super disciplined, all into that. And the Nazis were kind of all right with that. They didn't obviously like the fact that Rome was gay, but they did use that as an excuse to kind of get rid of him. But they were more concerned about the fact that he was this a tactician and strategist and a threat to Hitler's power. But he was also extremely hyper masculine. And another somewhat ironic way you can understand what the Nazis thought about him, what they thought of as ideal or perfect, was through someone called Werner Goldsberg, who was a half-Jewish soldier who served in the Nazi army. And he was used in recruitment posters and propaganda pieces, and he was considered the, quote, ideal German soldier in the German newspaper, the Berliner Tageblatt, which is ironic considering the fact that Werner was half-Jewish. But it's still the appearance of him is kind of the idea for what they wanted, that idea of the blonde-haired, blue-eyed figure who is super capable. And so that's kind of the basic of the ideal for the Nazis. They want this person who's stoic, who is emotionally capable of himself. He's stern, he's physically capable. Again, the ideal of the soldier and stuff like that. And you can see that all throughout the propaganda posters and these strong physically type of characters who are able to take on any challenge for the German state.
Would you say that their idea for a manly man was more mental or physical? Because I believe that the physical characteristics of being a man, being buff, or being any bodybuilders that we would know now, our modern version of a manly man is very physical, and how heavy can you lift the weights? And so was it more physical? I mean, obviously they wanted them to be able-bodied, but I feel like a lot of what we talk about with Nazis are mental games and what they believed rather than what they looked like.
That's a really interesting question. I would say that based on like the research that I've done, that it's a bit more mental. It's more like mental character, like character of your heart, as opposed to physical character. But they're very much connected. And like if you could like again looking at like the propaganda posters, they're not like six pack abs and they're not like super buff in comparison to like some like extreme versions that you see with like in the Rock Johnson. They're not necessarily looking like that, but they are physically strong, obviously. But there's also like a certain type of character that the Nazis wanted, and this was very much you can kind of see this as well with how the Nazis treated boys and children because the Nazis wanted to mold younger people into a certain image, into be a certain way. So for example, there's this really good article by Joe Lisbrook called Masculinity in the Hitler Youth, which looks at how the Nazis used songs and music to transmit masculinities. And the Hitler Youth is like later on throughout the Nazi regime, it's basically forces every child to go through the Hitler Youth to be indoctrinated. Brucker in this article talks about how the Hitler Youth, quote, aimed at strengthening boys according to the principles of hard masculinity to survive according to social Darwinistic principles. The German people had to be powerful, and thus Hitler Youth activities were meant to keep the folk physically healthy and strong. So that's again like related to like the health and strength as well. But it's also very much like a mental character as well, a mental hardness of being able to do it. And like there's a certain character quality that the Nazis wanted, which is mostly like stoicism and like loyalty to the state, loyalty to like your people, and unwillingness to like break or leave as well. So there's very much a physical aspect. There's also a mental aspect to it as well. And another example is that the physical and the character mental aspects are very much intertwined and connected.
Yeah. I would say along the same lines, the mentality of a manly man was a lot more important, as we've established, for the Nazis. Besides that, was there anything that was over the top? Like, what specifically did they accentuate way too much to make it wrong, or what did they get right? I suppose.
That's a very loaded question because it's going to depend like a lot of like how one views because masculinity and femininity are very interesting topics in any culture in any scenario. I would say like the Nazi ideology is very much, at least in some level, a reaction to what had happened in the 1920s during Weimar Germany, which is after World War One. For example, in Weimar Germany, there's like in Berlin, there was like lots of like gay clubs and even like some trans surgeries that had actually happened in Germany for very few people at that time, and it was a very interesting time and very progressive in the sense of for that time. A lot of people were kind of like disenfranchised by that. The Nazis were, in some level, something of a reaction towards that. But at the same time, the Nazis also had like very extreme racial hierarchy, as we've already mentioned. In that sense, it's like the Nazis had an understanding of like, these are men and we're supposed to be like this. But they also like accentuated that to such a degree that it was like men basically had no emotion. They were supposed to be like dominant physically, mentally, and all the levels like that. And not only like men in general, but like specifically Aryan men were like the best, and they were supposed to be the best. And it's also an extreme fervent loyalty to like to the party, to the state. You didn't like betray them. You didn't like back anything like that. So I think if we want to focus on like some of the more negative aspects of the Nazi ideology, which of course there's lots of them, it's the extreme levels they went to not only one like basically indoctrinate children, but also to just like keep hold of power and like the focus of power itself, and the fact that like power is basically all that you wanted for men to like try to achieve, but also power for the state itself. Hitler, for example, like had this really deep attraction to this one Greek statue called Discobolus, which depicted a male nude figure and was supposed to represent strength and power. And that's, I think, very much the key understanding about the Nazis is that like it's all about strength and power, specifically for Aryan men. That's the goal. That's what they want. They want domination. They want total subjugation, and they want to exercise that through force, often physical force.
Yeah. And you've brought up Nazi youth a lot. How did the training up or the indoctrination of the kids who were in Nazi youth, which I believe were all of them at that time, how did that lead into their agenda for manly men and for needing to be needing to start young. Like if you start them young, they will grow into the ideal man that they had. So what steps did they take in that area to try and make that a reality for them?
Yeah. So the Nazis had, again, the organization called the Hitler Youth, which was both for boys and girls. And just in regards to the boys specifically, it's kind of like an evil Girl Scouts and Boy Scout that type of mind, because it's very much about like physical activities, doing stuff outdoors, and Hitler expanded it so that the Nazi youth was basically a mandatory thing that you had to do. There's like both social pressure and like state pressure in order to get your kids into the Hitler Youth and to have them join that. And so for boys, it was all about like physical activities, training them to basically be mini soldiers. I think this was shown very well in the film Jojo Rabbit, which I know that you and I have both watched, which again shows the main character, being outside in the woods, and then like it's a bit like satirized, but the idea of like learning about like survival tactics and hunting and tracking and all that sort of stuff. And like Hitler once said in like 1935 that he wanted the youth to be, quote, swift as greyhound, as tough as leather, and as hard as croup steel. So the idea was very much that they wanted to take young boys and train them into be like essentially good soldiers and servants of the state, no matter what they were going to do, and to be like physically capable and ideologically devoted to the Nazi party, to the Nazi state, to the German people, all of that. And so again, like they started very young.
I think the final question that I have is comparing what they had back then, especially in Germany, as a manly man, as they wanted for their army and what they wanted to serve Hitler. How is that comparable in some way to what we have now? Because we have this incline again in working out as a way to be a manly man, as a mindset goal of all these different things that make you a better man. Are there any good things that are comparable, or is there some things that are like, oh, maybe I see a comparison that's not good? What do you think
Mm-hmm.
about that?
I mean, yeah, that's a bit of an interesting and kind of difficult question. I would say that, like, in any ideology, there's always some measure of truth and some measure of some measure of worth that you can get out of it. And I think the fact that like the Nazis did focus on like, physical readiness, especially for like boys and stuff like that, and like being like capable, and like general masculinity is not necessarily a terrible thing. But at the same time, the Nazis also had an extreme focus on that. They also had an extreme like focus on combining like the like ideas like strength and power in connection to extreme loyalty to the state, like, and also the racial element of it as well. So I think like the Nazis basically had an extreme expectation for what men should be, which is essentially dominating powers that were like over everything, specifically Aryan men, and that is obviously an extremity that we don't ever want to go to. But there is still something to be said about the fact that the Nazis did have an interest and focus on masculinity in general, and the roles that like guys had to do in society. Then again, also they wanted to basically make their own race prosper to the disappointment of literally everybody else. Yeah, and they also didn't really have like workout gyms or anything like that. So, which is a bit interesting.
Yeah.
Then again, like most people were kind of ordinary workers themselves, but like the workout room and space in the gym and the weight room and stuff like that, that's more of a modern and kind of odd phenomenon that really seems to be unique, and in comparison to like kind of the average life I'd suspect of most people at that time, who just generally lived probably more strenuous lives than we kind of do today.
Yeah, I mean, they were a lot more active back then, but also when it came to military training, it wasn't just lifting weights and all that. It was doing drills and being fit in the ways that they would need to be on the battlefield. I didn't mean specifically as gyms, but fitness level, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, and there's something to be said about, again, like the mentality aspect, where I think that's a very much, and the idea of like a certain character they wanted, which is like unswerving loyalty. You have to give some credit to the Nazis. Like they were this one state was somehow bold enough and kind of dumb enough, but still bold enough to try and take off both France and like Britain and eventually America, and attack Russia at the same time. And the fact that they kind of started pulling it off at the early stages of World War One is a testament to the fact of like how capable they were able to turn this nation of guys into like like devoted followers who were willing to like die to the last man essentially to fight. And the fact that they obviously it was like even with like a smaller population compared to like Russia and stuff like that, the fact that they were able to like go so far with what they had is quite impressive, even if the cost was terrible.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a great day.
Yeah, it was my pleasure.